Hello guys, and welcome to another discussion video. And yesterday, Nintendo shut down yet another tournament for Smash, and this was through Project Plus, which is basically a mod for Super Smash Bros. Brawl. And yeah, we could definitely see that Nintendo is out of touch with the esports and competitive gaming community. I mean, even though that they try to maybe push certain aspects, like they try to do tournaments and stuff like that, it just really seems like they're out of touch, even like with them not being able to fund certain big tournaments and even some restrictions on prize money and stuff like that. It just really seems like Nintendo's out of touch with that. That was originally what this discussion was going to be about, but I wanted to go into something else that I actually made a tweet about on Twitter that gained some attention on there. So I feel like a lot of people aren't really looking at this issue, or I guess like it's kind of partially an issue, partially a thing that more people should be aware of. And the fact that Nintendo as a company is very different from the part of Nintendo that's a developer. Because even though it's the same entity, these people have very different jobs, and it can kind of feel like the Nintendo company part is way more out of touch than the part of Nintendo that actually develops things, like makes games, makes hardware, and stuff like that. And I do feel like sometimes the company part of Nintendo can restrict the developer part of Nintendo. They can even develop, or they could even impact the development of like other companies too that are developing games for Nintendo. And before we get into like everything that the development side of Nintendo does, because I feel like that is the much better side of Nintendo, we're gonna like talk a little bit about how some of the games that Nintendo is putting out aren't all from Nintendo, because we do have some games like from Intelligent Systems, Monolith Soft, Game Freak, different companies like that, like Paper Mario, Pokemon, and then Mario Sports. It may feel like some entries in those series aren't to the same quality as Nintendo's in-house games, and I think that might be because of something that I'll get into later with Nintendo as a company. But that is not really what I'm not really counting those as like Nintendo's own games, because I'm really referring to like Nintendo EPD and the games that they develop. So basically, with that side of Nintendo, the game development side of Nintendo, that is where all of most of their good games come from. That's why we still enjoy Nintendo games today. That's why I love playing Nintendo games. That's why I really like making videos about them, and that's why I really like the Switch, and then even all of the consoles before that too can technically count. And we still really like these games, even though Nintendo is doing these bad business decisions, is because the development part of Nintendo is very different from the company part of Nintendo, despite being a part of the same entity. So, because they have completely different jobs, being like game developers, and then they're coordinating the games together and everything. So I don't really think it's fair to really blame the games, or really tie the Nintendo games into most of Nintendo's controversies, unless it's like something in the game, which I'll get into later, like with the fix-it-later approach, which is definitely something coming from the more company side of Nintendo. But the games overall are really good, and sure, there are some bad games that come out of Nintendo's own development teams and everything, and there's always bad games from like almost every big development studio. Like, it kind of, like, most of the games in general are pretty good. I know a lot of people are saying that there's like only a small percentage of really good games on the Switch, and then there's a lot of just mediocre games. But most of those really good games that we're getting on the Nintendo Switch, like Super Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild, Mario Maker, different different things like that, Animal Crossing New Horizons, those games are coming from Nintendo themselves and Nintendo EPD, and they're not really the games, like the games that are mostly considered like mediocre or not on par, like with Nintendo's better games, those are usually developed by the other studios. And I'm not saying that those other studios can't develop games that are amazing. Like, I mean, we have Smash Ultimate and other games like that are really good. And also like Fire Emblem, Xenoblade, those games made by other developers that Nintendo or that are developing for Nintendo, they're still amazing, but there are some that fall behind, especially ones from like Camelot and even Intelligent Systems. There's a different problem with Intelligent Systems, more of the kind of restriction side, which is I could kind of tie into Nintendo as a company, but I'll get into that right when we talk about Nintendo as a company. But yeah, basically Nintendo's games tend to be really good, and usually with other companies developing games for Nintendo, on the most part they're pretty good, but usually most of the great games we're getting on the Nintendo Switch, there really doesn't seem to be any bad game developed by Nintendo themselves. There has been in the Wii U era and before that, but like for the most part, the games that are developed by Nintendo themselves are really good on the Nintendo Switch. And moving over to Nintendo as a company, that is where most of the bad decisions are coming from. Like Nintendo's executives and more of the marketing side of Nintendo, and kind of more of the side that we see them take down fan games, shut down these tournaments, like shut down ROM sites, make all of these decisions like the fix it later approach, which basically puts restrictions on Nintendo's own games, even games from other companies developing from Nintendo. I feel like they're the ones making most of the bad decisions with Nintendo, and Nintendo as a company really isn't good. I mean, it's almost comparable to stuff like EA. I mean, I still think EA is obviously worse, because, like, I mean, you could say that EA has like bad working conditions, and Nintendo definitely doesn't have that. I've heard in the past that Nintendo actually does have decent, if not really good, working conditions, which is good. But bad business decisions are also bad, and they also really shouldn't be a thing. So we should also keep the bad business decisions in mind. And it really feels like the game developers are more in touch with the actual fans themselves than the company actually is, because it seems like the company is always doing very backwards things. Like with Nintendo Switch Online, it's just the peer-to-peer program or service on there is just really laggy, and it's really unreliable, and they really should rely on servers, and actually when they do use servers, they should use newer servers, and I'm glad they're actually fixing that now. But it really, and when you look back at the games themselves, like when they went to Super Mario Odyssey, fans have been wanting an open sandbox 3D Mario game, and it actually seems like they've listened, and they've actually made a creative and unique Mario game after nearly a decade of basically generic new Super Mario Bros. Style Mario games and spin-offs. So it really feels like they were more in touch with that, and also kind of adding like a lot of nice little touches, quality of life features into games, and it feels like there's a lot more connection to like the actual players with the games. And then looking at Nintendo as a company, it just feels like they're doing so much against the people buying their products and the fans and everything, and it just really seems like they're out of touch. And I can't really blame the game developers on any of this, because I feel like even in some circumstances that they're actually kind of disagreeing with what the actual company is doing. And one example that I'm actually going to go into is actually not related to Nintendo directly. This may happen within Nintendo themselves, but this is like involving like an executive with Nintendo that is interfering with the game And, I mean, you could say this could happen within Nintendo themselves with their games, but this is actually dealing with intelligent systems with Paper Mario, the Origami King, and actually this could maybe apply for the other Paper Mario games before that too, like with Sticker Star and Color Splash. And basically, Kensuke Tanabe is putting a lot of these restrictions on Paper Mario that weren't there before, and a lot of games had this restriction up until around 2017 when Super Mario Odyssey came out. Well, it's speculated that most games had it because most games were generally pretty generic aside from Mario Kart and 3D World and Mario and Luigi Dream Team, but most other games were pretty generic and had a lot of influence from New Super Mario Bros. Wii. But now that a lot of Mario spin-offs are actually getting a lot better, like even Mario Tennis and Golf are adding like original bosses and characters and everything. But with Paper Mario the Origami King, there was a lot of restrictions on the game. But Tanabe was saying a lot of these things in the interviews. But it seemed like a lot of the things in the game are really pushing up against the restrictions. Like, there was one quote where he said, there can't be any new characters that touch on the Mario world. But there was like whole sections of the game that created like new lore that specifically kind of changed the whole idea of like different things in the Mushroom Kingdom, kind of like the elemental bosses in the game and the character Captain Toad. It really did touch on the Mushroom Kingdom because it kind of changed the lore of the game. So it kind of felt like the developers of that game really didn't agree with the restrictions and were actually kind of creating loopholes. And it just really seems like a lot of these decisions that Nintendo is making, even though that specific thing was just kind of related to both Nintendo and intelligent systems, but there's also the fix-it-later approach in different things like that. But I really hope that the developers will have more influence over like some of their games and not be able to have, or not have to go through like these different restrictions and everything. So like I feel like a lot of things would benefit from that. And it just, ever since going into another thing here, ever since Shintaro Furukawa kind of took power at Nintendo, I believe it was 2018, there's been a lot of changes, and even though like stuff like Nintendo Switch Online was still planned, there could have been a more solid approach at Nintendo Switch Online before Furukawa came in at Nintendo. So it just seems like a lot of the decisions that are made by Nintendo nowadays are kind of fueled by him and kind of his decisions at the company, which is why I really don't agree with him. And this is kind of like obviously Nintendo as a company, and it just feels like they're out of touch and they're just really not doing much for their actual consumers and everything, and it just feels like they're anti-consumer in a lot of different ways. And I'm glad that the developers are still really good. I'm still glad that we're able to get all these really good games like WarioWare Get It Together. Like, I think that's co-developed by Nintendo themselves with Intelligent Systems. And then we got Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury earlier this year directly from Nintendo, and that was amazing. And we're also getting Breath of the Wild 2, Splatoon 3, different games like that. I'm not going to count games like Metroid Dread, because that's mostly Mercury Steam, and then Pokemon is obviously Game Freak. And then there's also those other games. I think there's a remake of Advance Wars. I think that game is being developed by WayForward. But all the games that are coming up from Nintendo look amazing, and I still feel like they're kind of picking it up again with their games and everything. In 2020, I mean, I feel like that was one of Nintendo's worst years, and despite like everything that Nintendo did, I still feel like they went through a lot, like with their development, and a lot of games were pushed back. But I'm glad they're actually still doing well with their games and everything. But what needs to step up with Nintendo is their company and their business practices. And I feel like people should be viewing Nintendo, like with their company, differently than they view Nintendo as a developer, not clumping them into one thing. Because there's usually two sides of the fan base when we're looking at Nintendo. There's usually the side that is usually more, let's say, like they usually defend Nintendo more. Like Twitter calls them Nintendrones, but I'm not gonna say that because I want this to be more a professional discussion and everything, and I don't really want to get sidetracked with stuff like that. Then there's also the people that are more critical of Nintendo and almost get toxic from being too critical of Nintendo. And I kind of fall in the middle because I really like Nintendo's games, but I am very critical of their company side. But looking into these two sides of fans, I mean, obviously they're kind of vocal minorities, but they are vocal, so we do need to look into this. But basically the side that defends Nintendo more usually defends them because they really like the games, and they think when people are critical of Nintendo, it's an attack on them because they really like the games. And what they're doing wrong is that they're not really looking at Nintendo as a developer and a company. They're just looking at Nintendo as Nintendo makes really good games, and people really shouldn't bash on Nintendo because they're making good games. And then the other side, the people who are too critical of Nintendo, like to the point where they're toxic, they're kind of they're like hating people for liking certain games that don't even have to do with any of Nintendo's decisions, and they're failing to look at Nintendo as both a developer and a company. So I just really feel like Nintendo should be viewed in two different ways, because there's a lot of discussions about people kind of misinterpreting everything, thinking the games, yeah, sure, like when you buy a game, it does go into the company and everything, into their decisions and everything, but they're still, like, the games still represent the developers, and they're still good games. So you're still supporting good games when you buy a good game like that. So I really don't think you should be kind of tying those games into Nintendo's bad decisions. So that's basically my opinion on that. I kind of fall in the middle of everything, like I said before, and I will never defend any of these bad practices, but I still will continue to like the games that Nintendo are making, because as I stated a lot of times in this video, because it's kind of the main topic, Nintendo as a developer and Nintendo as a company are very different. So anyways, thank you guys for watching this video. What are your thoughts on everything like that with Nintendo as a company and Nintendo as a developer? And make sure to check out my Discord server and Twitter if you want to. Goodbye.